Good morning.
Sir.
Yeah.
So,
Shall we
should
begin?
we? Yeah, yeah, sir. Should we start, sir?
Yeah,
So,
I'm ready.
okay, okay. So, good morning to all, and welcome in our day 4 session 2. So, the name of the speaker in this session is Dr. Anindya Datta, professor from IIT Bombay. The title of his talk is Photogenic Molecules for Analyte Sensing and Intercellular Imaging. Professor Datta is currently working as a professor in chemistry department at IIT Bombay. He obtained his BSc degree from Presidency College, University of Calcutta, and MSc degree from University of Calcutta. Further, he received his PhD degree from Indian Association for the Cultivation of Science, Jadavpur, in the field of picosecond laser spectroscopy in 1998. He was also a lecturer in Raidighi College from 1997 to 1998. Later, he pursued his postdoctoral studies from Iowa State University, USA, 1998 to 2000. After that, he was a visiting scientist at Raja Ramanna Center for Advanced Technology, Indore, India, 2000 to 2002. He had joined IIT Bombay in the year of 2002, and now he is serving as a full professor in the Department of Chemistry. He was an associate dean student affairs at IIT Bombay from 2013 to 2015. Head he was the head Center for Research and Nanotechnology and Center for Sophisticated Analytical Instrument Facility from 2016 to 2018, and HOD in Department of Chemistry from 2018 to 2021. So he has received several awards. Some of them I mentioned here, sir. So Bronze Medal in Chemistry Research Society of India 2018, then National Academy of Science Fellow in 2017, then Department Award Excellent in Teaching from IIT Bombay in 2017, and then G.V. Bakore Memorial Award in 2011, Young Researcher Award in 2006, and Young Investigator Award in 2005 from IIT Bombay. He is also a member of Editorial Advisory Board, the Journal of Physical Chemistry, and his research interest includes the time resolved spectroscopy and microscopy, photogenic molecule excitation dynamics in semiconductor nanocrystals, high harvesting nano antenna, and biomaterials. He had guided 17 PhD students and published more than 130 papers in peer-reviewed journal, and he also published some books and book chapter also. So thank you, sir. Maybe I could not cover the all things. So
It's not necessary.
okay, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you for your valuable time.
Thank you, Ananta. Thanks for having invited me. And it's a pleasure to be here today. Of course, it would have been even more pleasant to be actually able to visit this beautiful place where the host institution is. But given the current situation, we'll take a rain check on that. Hopefully, we can do it later on. I'm going to share with you over the next maybe 45 minutes or so some of the excitement in research that we have had in recent times. I would like to request you to stop me and ask questions in between as and when you have them. In any case, at the end we can take the questions, but please do feel free to stop me. It's a homely gathering. It is not an issue. Let me start with a word of thanks to the people who actually do the work. You see them here. This is my research group, and this photograph is taken right beside Powai Lake. Somewhere in this grassland you might find an alligator, and we are in a veritable jungle, and we'll come back to that at the end of the talk. And behind the lake, you can see another kind of jungle, the concrete jungle, where the rich and powerful stay and work. For the 19 years or so that we have been in IIT Bombay, our group has tried to elucidate excited state processes in molecules and materials. Our major interest is in molecules that have unusual photophysics. 5-aminoquinoline, for example, or 3-aminoquinoline. What you see here is 3-aminoquinoline. It has rather unusual photophysics. Generally, for organic molecules that are fluorescent, you expect them to have less fluorescence in more polar solvents and greater fluorescence in less polar solvents. For 3-aminoquinoline, it's just the opposite, and we have worked out why it is just the opposite. Over the last 8-9 years, we have been looking at exotic nanostructures, and I'm going to talk very briefly about this work today. It has been a long-standing dream to make nano antennae out of conjugates of fluorescent dyes and silica. Well, it sounded very promising when we set out to do it. When we started working on it, we understood that it is more complex than what we thought, and perhaps we need the help of plasmonic nanoparticles, gold or silver, to achieve it. That is what initiated our interest in plasmonic nanoparticles. We have looked at gold nanoparticle assemblies in collaboration by and large with Professor Alison Funston of Monash University. And biophysical chemistry is an area that we'd like to get into, and we are trying to do it in collaboration with Professor Kamendra Sharma of our institute and Professor Samrat Mukhopadhyay of Aizawl Mohali. I do not have to perhaps explain too much about fluorescence spectroscopy and time resolved spectroscopy, because you have heard a couple of talks already, one from Prabhat and one from Suban. Very briefly, what we try to do is this: we create an excited state population, a population of molecules in their excited state, by an ultra short pulse of light, laser. So some of the molecules get excited. And then once the light goes off, because when we're saying pulse, what it means is that the light is on for a small time and then it is off for a long time. The moment the light goes off, the population in the excited state starts decaying. So if you could plot population against time with sufficient time resolution, you'd get a plot like this. This vertical line corresponds to the instantaneous excitation process, and then the time at which it happens is called the zero time. Post zero time, as the population decays slowly, you expect to see this kind of a graph. In the simplest case scenario is going to be a first order process. So excited state population n at t, where t is the time after excitation, after zero time, is equal to n at 0, the population at 0 time, the peak here, multiplied by e to the power minus kt. If you are chemistry students, then all of us have encountered integrated first order rate laws like this. Now it is conventional in time resolved spectroscopy to not work with the rate constant kt, but to work with the time constant tau, where tau is simply the reciprocal of the rate constant. So rate constant has dimensions of per second, so tau has dimensions of time. Unit of per second, so tau has dimensions of time. It is called the lifetime, and it has some significance as well, because if you do the math, you'll see that for an exponential decay, tau turns out to be the most probable time that a molecule spends in the excited state, right? That is why it is given the name lifetime. Otherwise, time constant would be good enough. More often than not, a single exponential decay model is insufficient to describe what happens post-excitation, and then we need more complicated models. The simplest and sometimes misused model is a sum of exponential terms, a weighted sum, a linear combination of exponential decays, which is commonly called multi-exponential decay, where n at t is given by the same n at 0 multiplied by sum over I ai e to the power minus t by tau I, where ai and tau I are the amplitudes and lifetimes respectively of the ith component. Amplitude tells us about the contribution of the ith component, and tau I tells us how quickly the corresponding excited state decays. You might have noted that I said that this is the most popular and perhaps the most misused model as well. The reason why I bring up misused model is that, see, something that looks like this can always be fitted by a sum of exponentials. But it is not necessary that a sum of exponentials is the correct model to use. For example, if we have something bound to a protein, or something bound to a membrane, and it is in different parts of the membrane. So the lifetime is, say, 7 nanosecond plus minus 1 nanosecond, something like that. This is going to fit nicely if we use a bi-exponential fitting model of say 3 nanosecond and 10 nanoseconds, something like that. Because the insufficiency of one parameter lifetime can always be made up for by changing the other component, that is the amplitude. However, a much better model to use in this case would be something like a stretched exponential model, because essentially the lifetime is 7 nanosecond plus minus something. The plus minus comes because the fluorophore is distributed over different regions of the membrane or whatever it is. Unfortunately, this multi-exponential decay model has become so popular that nobody even thinks of using anything else. And one thing that I should say is that we are going to talk about fluorescence, quantum yield and all that very quickly, very soon. Fluorescence quantum yield is related to the lifetime, this lifetime. Well, when you talk about fluorescence, of course we call it fluorescence lifetime. It is related to it like this: Kr multiplied by tau f, where Kr is the radiative rate constant and 1 minus phi f is the non-radiative rate constant KNR multiplied by tau f. What am I talking about here? I'm talking about this. You have a ground state, you have an excited state. Excited, it is possible to depopulate the excited state by a non-radiative process associated with a rate constant KNR, or by a radiative process involving emission of a photon. Let us say the rate constant there is Kr. The lifetime is defined as 1 divided by Kr plus KNR. And Kr divided by KNR, well, Kr divided by Kr plus KNR, that is Kr multiplied by tau, that essentially tells you what fraction of the excited state depopulation is through the radiative pathway, because denominator gives you the overall rate constant, numerator gives you the rate constant of the radiative process. So what fraction of the depopulation is radiative? That is what essentially is quantum yield phi f. So please remember, there is a relationship between quantum yield and lifetime, and I say it explicitly because well, I thought this is common knowledge. Apparently, it is not. Uh, in uh, in fact, in one of our recent papers, we got a reviewer comment where even the reviewer did not know that the fluorescence, quantum yield, and lifetime are related to each other. Since fluorescence has become a very common tool, it is important that whoever uses it at least knows the basics. So that is why I thought I'll say it just in case. Now, what happens when there's a multi-exponential decay? Once again, very commonly one uses something called average lifetime. Average lifetime can be defined in two ways: sum over I, ai tau I, and sum over I, ai tau I square divided by sum over I, ai tau I. This is called the amplitude weighted average.
Hello, sir.
Yes.
Sir, I'm sorry to ask question in between.
Yes,
but
no, don't be sorry. Please go ahead.
Sir, here you have written that fluorescent quantum yield equals to Kr by rate constant of the reaction by Kr plus K and Nr, right, sir?
Yeah.
So this basically our Michaelis constant. This should be the constant value, right, sir?
This has got nothing to do with Michaelis constant. Michaelis constant has got to do with enzyme activity.
Okay, sir. Okay, sir.
Okay. Thanks. Right. So this is amplitude weighted average, and this is what is called the intensity weighted average. Right. So actually, this is what one should use if average lifetime must be used. Personally, I prefer that we don't use average lifetime at all. Right. So we'll not go into the detail of the basics of fluorescence spectroscopy. I have an NPTEL course, lectures of which are available freely on YouTube. If you search Anindya Datta ultra fast, then you'll get those. So that we have discussed these issues, and hopefully next July 2022, from next July, we are going to have another NPTEL course on fluorescence spectroscopy and microscopy, where we are going to deal with these questions in significantly more detail.
Sir,
Right.
one
Yes, go ahead.
sir, as you have shown that in the first figure, right, sir, that only few molecules get excited, right, in the excited state from ground level.
Yes,
So
exactly.
if you doubly irradiated by radiation, and if the population is same in the excited state as well as in the ground state, and that time we'll reach the saturation levels, right, sir? So at that time, what will be the result? What will be the outcome?
Achha. So first of all, uh, as you know, population inversion is never achieved in a two-level system, right? Population of the excited state can never be more than the population of the ground state. This population inversion is a basic requirement for lasing action, and we will never be able to achieve it for a two-level system. This is worked out in, say, Macquarie and Simon's physical chemistry book. And if we go to the situation, and in our experiments, we never reach a situation where the population of the excited state is equal to that of the ground state. We always work in a situation where we are only sampling. This is a cartoon. I've drawn a small number of circles, but actually we work with what molar quantities, right? Molar quantity means even if you have 1 mole, it is 6.023 into 10 to the power 23. If you don't have a mole, even if you have a micromolar quantity, it is 6.023 into 10 to the power 23 into 10 to the power minus 6. 23 minus 6 is how much? 10 to the power minus 10 to the power 16.
16, yes.
Yes. No, not 16, 17. 10 to the power 17. So these are crores of molecules are there. And the kind of light that we use would only promote a very small fraction, maybe 1 lakh. 1 lakh out of 10 to the power, say 15, 16 molecules is a very small portion. And if you somehow use very highly intense lasers and promote the promote half of the molecules to the excited state, then also you expect the same kind of decay, provided there is no additional pathway that opens up as a result of interaction among the molecules that are in the excited state. Viman, have I been able to answer your question?
Yes, sir. Suppose by any means, if you get the same population, right, sir, in the excited in the ground state, then there will be no further reaction. There will be no.
There will be no further excitation. Yes,
Yeah.
but you know what happens is that you produce an excited state population. It doesn't stay for too long. It starts
Yes, sir.
decaying right away.
Yes, sir.
So suppose you use an intense pulse. Very nice question, Viman. Thanks for asking. Suppose you use an intense pulse at this time, and you create an excited state population that is equal to the ground state population. It starts decaying right away. So even after a small time, if you look at it, and you've used a pulse, the light has gone off, excited state population has decayed to this value, right? So again, there is an imbalance. So downward transition will keep happening. And if the light is on, then the only thing that you can hope is that the rate of excitation is equal to the rate of de-excitation. So that way the excited state population will remain same. But we are talking about a situation that is not equilibrium. We are exciting with a pulse. We excite with a pulse, light goes off. Now the molecules in the excited state are going to decay on their own. That is why you expect it to be a first order process in the first place.
Sir, provided the lifetime of the excited molecule should be very less, right, sir?
Even if the lifetime is more, see, lifetime is an average number, isn't it? It is not as if you promote 1 lakh molecules to the excited state and the lifetime is say 100 nanoseconds. It's not as if that all the molecules are in the excited state for 100 nanoseconds. Some molecules start coming down right away. It is a statistical thing. So if you look carefully, what happens if I put t equal to tau in this expression? If you put t equal to tau, so then you get n at tau is equal to n at time 0 divided by e. So e is what is the value of e? 2.3 something. Let us say approximately 3. So lifetime for a single exponential decay is essentially the time taken for the excited state population to decay from its initial value to 1/3 of its value. This value, right? This is the lifetime. But by that time, 2/3 of the excited state population, well, 1/3, well, n at tau has become 1/3. So the remaining part has actually decayed. The decay starts right away. Now, whether the number of molecules that decay, that may be more or less depending on what the lifetime is and the time after which you measure, but it will never be exactly the same at the time 0.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
All right, thanks.
Yes.
Very nice question. All right, so we do two kinds of experiments. We are not going to talk about transient absorption today. In transient absorption spectroscopy, what one tries to do is one tries to record the absorption spectrum of the excited state. And the way one does it is this here is an amplified laser which gives us femtosecond pulses of 800 nanometer millijoule energy. They are used to pump what is called an optical parametric amplifier, which gives us femtosecond pulses of different color. So depending on which sample we use a part of this pump, a large part, to pump. Pump means that is the intense laser pulse that produces the excited state population. That is pump. And then what we do is we use another beam which is generated by the remaining residual part of the pulse that we had created. We generate white light by focusing it on a sapphire plate that is used to probe. Probe means the light goes through the sample. There are two spots that go through the sample, and one of the spots is overlaid with the pump. You can see this one. The other one is not overlaid with the pump, and the probe light goes into the detector. So in this figure, what you see is the blue line denotes pump, the yellow ones denote probe, and this is where our sample is. So on the sample, you can see one yellow line is overlaid with the blue line. This is the spot which is pumped, and the other one just goes through the sample. It is not overlaid. Now both of them are collected by two detectors. These black boxes that you see, these are the two detectors. So essentially, we can generate delta OD, which is the change in OD. OD means absorbance, and absorbance has got to do with color. If the absorbance is more at some wavelength, then the color will be intense. If the absorbance is less, then it is not. So delta OD is the essentially the absorbance in presence of pump minus absorbance in absence of pump. So we get spectra like this, and we look at the dynamics, which tells us about how the excited state population evolves with time. The experiments that we are going to talk about today are fluorescence experiments. There we don't look at absorption, rather we look at fluorescence intensity. Now see, fluorescence intensity at any time t after excitation is proportional to the excited state population at that time. So if the excited state population decays in a single exponential manner, then the fluorescence intensity I at t also decays in a single exponential manner. If the decay is multi-exponential, or if some other decay model is applicable, the same thing will apply for the fluorescence decay as well. And just to remind you, phi f is equal to k at tau. So longer tau means usually larger phi f, more intense fluorescence, and vice versa. So generally, to see whether the decay is single exponential or not, it is conventional to draw semi-log plots of intensity versus time. And the advantage of semi-log plot is that if the decay is exponential, then the semi-log plot is going to be a straight line. If the decay is anything other than exponential, then it is not going to be a straight line. Okay. So doing these experiments, we'll come to the fluorogenic molecule in a while. Before that, let me just give you a glimpse of some other work that we have done. Solvation dynamics is something that I started learning when I was a PhD student with Professor Kankan Bhattacharya in Indian Association for the Cultivation of Science many years ago. So, and say 1995, there was the first report by Professor Graham Fleming, who was in University of Chicago, now he is in Berkeley, of slow solvation. Fleming's group themselves said that solvation dynamics of water is ultra fast. It takes place in femtoseconds and picoseconds. But they showed that when you look at bound water in a cyclodextrin cavity, for example, then the solvation dynamics is very slow. And that is where we picked up, and we performed a lot of experiment on water bound to micelles, reverse micelles, liposomes, so on and so forth. And this work of Professor Bhattacharya actually inspired a lot of research across the world. And for the 20 years that followed, and even now, many groups across the world have engaged themselves in understanding the slow solvation and its implications, especially in biomolecules. Now, we had not worked in solvation dynamics for a long time because, I mean, you do something in PhD, you don't want to go there for a while at least. But then, about 5 years ago, we got interested in this slow solvation once again, but in a little different kind of system. We worked with 5-aminoquinoline. We wanted to understand what all this class of aminoquinolines can do, and it occurred to us that it is a good solvation probe. To be a good solvation probe, you want the excited state dipole moment to be significantly more than the ground state dipole moment. So when you excite it with a laser pulse, you switch on the dipole moment. And then the solvent around it, the polar solvent around it, rearranges and forms a solvation shell. So the question we asked is, if we take a small amount of polar solvent like acetonitrile or methanol in a bulk non-polar environment like heptane or ethyl acetate or something, we produce the solute dipole of the fluorophore by using an ultrafast laser pulse. How much time does it take for the dipolar solvent molecules, which is present in small quantities, to replace these non-polar solvent molecules around the newly created dipole and perform preferential solvation? And the answer we got is about 1 nanosecond. So once again, you see slow solvation. More recently, we have elucidated the role of hydrogen bonding in this slow solvation process. So the processes that participate in this, that contribute in this slow dynamics are translational diffusion of the polar solvent, reorientation of these solvent molecules, and while reorienting, it is not only polarity that matters, hydrogen bonding also plays an important role. That is what we have shown in these two papers, and we are particularly happy about the second paper because it gives us all a great pleasure and pride to announce that Journal of Physical Chemistry is publishing a virtual special issue in honor of Professor Kankan Bhattacharya. Kankan Bhattacharya Festschrift. Many papers of that collection are already published. This paper of ours, we are fortunate, has found its place in the Festschrift, and this nice looking picture that my student Sharmishta drew is going to appear in the cover of one of the Journal of Physical Chemistry issues sometime in near future. So this is what tells us our perspective of the story of slow dynamics of preferential solvation in polar non-polar solvent mixtures. Next, the other extreme is gold nanoparticles. As I told you, we are trying to understand what happens in gold nanoparticles and their assemblies in collaboration with Professor Alison Funston. Bala was a joint student who's just graduated and is a postdoc now. Hemen is carrying on that work. We really want, what we want is, we want gold nanoparticle that is coated with silica, and on that we want to add FRET donor and acceptor, and we want to see how much the effect of this gold core is on the FRET distances. But before that, we wanted to see what is the role of solvent. We observed this, we made this interesting observation that the solvent does have a role to play in electron phonon relaxation dynamics, even when this gold nanoparticle is covered with a shell of silica. It's a little surprising result. We were late entrants in the field of nanoparticles. As we know, we live in a nano world. Large portion of the current research effort is in the field of nanoscience and nanotechnology. And quantum dot nanoparticles have been studied very extensively over the last 20-25 years. We were so engrossed with our molecules that we entered this field only in 2014 or so. By that time, a lot of work was already done. Partly because of that, and partly because of this fascinating shape that our colleague Professor Rohit Srivastava of Bioscience and Bioengineering, Rohit is one of the Bhatnagar recipients of this year. He got us interested in this nano tetrapods of cadmium chalcogenides. So to cut a long story short, we have been able to make these nano tetrapods. To start with, they are hardly photoluminescent, but we have been able to play around with the defect states, and also we have been able to dope these nanotetrapods to produce reasonably photoluminescence. The quantum yield, as you see, is 38% or so. Lifetime is really very long. We have been able to prepare these doped nano crystals with interesting exciton dynamics and promising photoluminescence properties that we are now exploring. Now, one thing that we were not successful in doing is we wanted cadmium selenide nanotetrapods that would be soluble in water, dispersible in water. We could make such nanotetrapods. Unfortunately, they are absolutely not photoluminescent. So at this point of a time, my erstwhile postdoc, Shomadipta, who is now doing a second postdoc with Professor Abdelrazak Dohal in Toledo, Spain, and Shormishta, who's just about completing her PhD now, they decided that since we are interested in water-soluble quantum dots, and since the tetrapod that is soluble in water is not luminescent anyway, let us go back to basics, make spherical nano particles, quantum dots, and let us see whether there is some sensing application in it. So they prepared these polyethylene imine capped spherical cadmium sulfide quantum dots, which once again are reasonably strongly photoluminescent. Using pump probe spectroscopy, we were able to work out the intricate exciton dynamics that takes place. We were able to establish that intraband relaxation occurs with a time constant of about 0.38 picosecond, 380 femtosecond. Trapping of hot electrons takes place with a time constant of about 1.2 picosecond. The electrons that have cooled down by intraband relaxation can also be trapped, but that time constant is longer, the process is slower, 11 picosecond, and deep trapping occurs with a time constant of 129 picosecond. We could also establish that there is ultra-fast hole trapping from the valence band. Having established this, we wanted to explore sensing application of these tetrapods. I'm used to saying tetrapods all the time. Sensing application of these spherical quantum dots, and we found that the photoluminescence of these quantum dots is quenched specifically by lead, no other metal ion, only lead. Once again, very careful experiments and thorough data analysis, we were able to establish the reason. We understood that the reason why quenching takes place, first of all, is that when lead reaches the surface of the quantum dot, It sort of dislodges one of these sulfur atoms. Sulfur is not all that nicely passivated by PEI. So lead comes and displaces. So the moment the sulfur is not capped anymore, that is where you create a hole trap, and ultra fast hole trapping is observed. What follows is electron transfer with a time constant of 6.2 picosecond, and it is this electron transfer after the hole transfer that provides a complete non-radiative deactivation pathway. The exciton is no longer there. That is why the PL is quenched. Now the question is, why is it that lead quenches but no other metal ion? That is because lead is the only metal ion with sufficiently favorable reduction potential and all that does not have a good affinity with PEI. So it can sort of push PEI chains aside and get to the surface. All the other metal ions that are otherwise capable of participating in this electron transfer process don't even penetrate that barrier because they're effectively trapped by the polyethylene chain. And using time resolved spectroscopy, we could work out things like the binding constant of lead to these quantum dots. And so this is where the nanoparticle work is. I thought I'll talk a little bit about this because there is a potential sensing application here. We're doing a lot more work using this quantum dots. Professor Leela Srinivas Panchikalla's lab of our department has given us some cadmium sulfide quantum dots which have very, very strong emission. The student Hemen is trying to understand the exciton dynamics there. Tanuja is working on the formation of protein corona on biocompatible copper indium sulfide nanoparticles. And Prajit is very highly interested in perovskites, which is the order of the day. So we are trying to learn what happens in perovskites as well. But for the rest of the discussion today, we are going to talk about fluorogenic molecules, which is there in the title in the first place. Fluorogenic molecules are those which have very weak fluorescence to start with. And I think Subhan has talked about them already. But then by providing appropriate physical or chemical input, one can try to increase their fluorescence intensity and lifetime, and thereby try and devise sensing applications. The sensing could be analyte sensing or it could be environment sensing. So let's go one by one. This activity was started in a lab solely because of the interest of my erstwhile PhD student, Dr. Tuhin Khan. Tuhin has completed one postdoc and is presently in his second postdoc in Berlin. And the work is being carried forward by Shorodip, and I should have had one more photograph here, Orko Prabhu, who is a relatively new student. Shorodip is in his final year. Orko Prabhu has just joined. Orko Prabhu has recently qualified for Prime Minister's Research Fellowship, which is a matter of great pleasure for all of us in the lab. So Tuhin sort of conceived the idea that we should work with Schiff bases, and the Schiff base that he liked very much was cellophane. Now, cellophane is a molecule that has been studied by many groups. In fact, once I got into trouble because I gave a talk, this part of the talk somewhere, and then when I was returning from that venue, and those were days when I used to go and give talks actually. So there was this gentleman who approached me and said, "You have done my work." I said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "I have worked on cellophane. How can you do the work that I have done and you have not even cited my work?" So I got very scared. This was a young man, he was a postdoc somewhere. So I said, "Okay, I'll go through your papers and then see." Then I asked him, "Have you done femtosecond spectroscopy?" He said, "No." Then I told him, "See, that is what you have done. Molecule may be same, but we do different things." So I sometimes get scared talking about cellophane and all because somebody else might come and say, "You have done my work." Hopefully, I have not done anybody else's work here. Now, the thing is, this kind of Schiff bases are usually very weakly fluorescent. It is known that the first thing that happens when you excite this Schiff base is a proton transfer. Well, I think some of you in the audience would recognize this name. Mitra here is Shivaprasad Mitra of NEHU. He was a postdoc with Tamai. So Tamai, Grabowska and Pion, to some extent Duhal, these people have done extensive work, and what they have shown is that post-excitation, the first thing that happens is that this proton would get transferred to this nitrogen, giving rise to what is called excited state intramolecular proton transfer. So the ESIPT is another field where we have been interested for a very, very long time. You know, the first paper I ever published in 1995 was in ESIPT. So now, when ESIPT happens, you form what is called the so-called cis-keto state. We'll not enter a discussion that this is not really keto, there is no CO double bond. This is the nomenclature that is accepted, so let us take it as a proper noun, if nothing else. It is a cis-keto state that is emissive. But then, the molecular skeleton is so flexible. You can have rotation about this carbon-carbon bond. You can have rotation about this carbon-nitrogen bond. You can have photoisomerization about this CN double bond. And all these processes provide effective non-radiative decay pathways that depopulate the excited state without emission of a photon. So the idea is, if you can rigidify the molecule, and one very elegant way of rigidifying the molecule would be to prepare a metal complex, then all this flexibility would go. And since the flexibility would go, the associated non-radiative deactivation pathways would also be suppressed. The question is, do you get enhancement of emission in that case? The other way of getting enhancement of emission would be to make crystals, or maybe just a thin film or something, where once again the molecule would not be able to move so much. Does the fluorescence go up? If it does, then this is a promising fluorogenic molecule. What we saw was that if you make metal complexes, you do get rigidification, fine. But with metals, you also get what is called the heavy atom effect that depopulates the singlet state very effectively and takes the molecule to the excited keto state, which is not fluorescent. They may or may not be phosphorescent, especially in absence of oxygen, but fluorescence is killed. So for all metal ions that we have tested, except for zinc and aluminum, we get complexes that are non-fluorescent. Only the zinc and aluminum complexes are fluorescent, because that is where heavy atom effect is not so much. The effect of rigidification outweighs heavy atom effect, if any. Aluminum in any case is a very light element.
So,
interestingly, yes, go ahead please.
Only the transition metal form complexes, or any other alkali metals also can do?
We did not get any change with alkali metals.
Okay, sir.
It can, but as you know, see, the thing is, these are chelating compounds, right? So two things are very important in complex formation. One is this hard soft acid base theory, and the other thing is the bite size. Since a chelating complex, only metal ions with appropriate size is going to form stable complexes. Okay. Now, these fluorescent complexes that we get with aluminum and zinc, they are not equally fluorescent. I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that in the figure that I'm showing here, quantum yield is shown in a logarithmic scale. It is not linear scale. So upon complexation with zinc, there is an increase in fluorescence quantum yield compared to the free base ligand by about an order of magnitude. Upon formation of complex with aluminum, there is a further increase of almost 2 orders of magnitude. So the question is, why is it that the aluminum complex is more fluorescent than the zinc complex? Both are more fluorescent than the free base ligand because of rigidification, fine. Why is it that the aluminum complex is more fluorescent than the zinc complex? Let us take a rain check on this question. We'll come back to it. Before that, let me share with you the time resolved data. See, the fluorescence of free-base cellophane gets over in say 100 picosecond or so. Okay, I think this is not labeled very nicely. The red one is cellophane decay. Upon complexation with zinc, the decay becomes a little slower. A little, not a lot. So you might remember that fluorescence lifetime and fluorescence quantum yield are supposed to be proportional to each other. So it is not surprising that it increases, but it doesn't increase too much. The aluminum complex exhibits much longer decay. In fact, the decay does not get over in the picosecond timescale at all, and we get a nanosecond decay. So this establishes the fact that non-radiative pathway decays are significantly less in the aluminum complex than in the zinc complex. The question is why. Another thing that we can say here is that if you're talking about sensing of analytes, the spectra are more or less the same for the zinc and the aluminum complex. Quantum yields are different, but suppose you have to determine zinc in presence of aluminum or the other way around. If you just take out a fluorescence spectrum, it will not be enough, right? Because you don't know how much of the intensity is for the zinc complex, how much it is for the aluminum complex. If you look at lifetimes, however, you see there's a distinctly fast lifetime in case of the complexes that are formed in presence of zinc as well as aluminum. That is the signature of the zinc complex. So what we are trying to say is that if you want to do aluminum sensing with cellophane, for whatever reason, lifetime is perhaps a better parameter than intensity, because the difference in lifetimes is significantly more than the difference in quantum yields. And that is because you have different kinds of non-radiative processes in the two systems. What we think is the reason why the aluminum complex is more fluorescent than zinc complex, well, it's actually twofold. Last year or so, there was this paper in Chemistry European Journal, which sort of reminded us that zinc forms more stable, less flexible complexes with this kind of cellophane-like molecules, chip bases, because of this hard and soft acid-base interaction. So that is one reason, perhaps. The second reason is that for these kind of complexes, usually they can be either monomeric or dimeric. We established that the aluminum complex is definitely monomeric. And there are reports for similar complexes that the zinc complex is dimeric with pi stacking. So if that is the case, in the zinc complex, two cellophane moieties come very close to each other within pi stacking distance. If that is the case, then you can have interaction between them, energy transfer, exchange formation, whatever, and that can add to the arsenal of non-radiative processes for the zinc complex that is not present in the aluminum complex. Unfortunately, we have not been able to get crystals of the zinc complex, but we have some mass spectroscopy data that seems to tell us that it is possible that the zinc complex is dimeric. So for now, we go with that hypothesis, and as you'll see, we'll come to some circumstantial evidence soon. So this is one part of the story. Next, we wanted to see the effect of rigidification. Do the lifetimes increase upon rigidification? So we took cellophane in 3-methyl pentane, room temperature, decay is ultra fast. In PMMA matrix, immediately you see there is a nanosecond decay and it is not exponential. That is because in PMMA matrix, most likely there are many different conformers that are present for cellophane. When you make a drop cast film, then the decay is more single exponential and slower, even slower and definitely single exponential for crystal. And if you go down to 77 Kelvin, that is when all activated non-radiative processes are killed, then the lifetime is the longest. So for solution, we have picosecond lifetime. For crystal, we have nanosecond lifetime for the free base ligand. If we compare this with the situation in the aluminum complex. Aluminum complex already has nanosecond lifetime in solution phase itself. Interestingly, when we make crystals out of it, the lifetime decreases and becomes picosecond. So, a free base ligand complexation causes a change in lifetime from picosecond to nanosecond. For the aluminum complex, it is exactly the other way around. Why? We thought the question why can be answered if we look at the crystal structure once again, and this time zoom out a little bit and look at molecular packing. It turns out that free base cellophane, first of all, has its rings which are perpendicular to each other, and they stack in such a way that no two rings close to each other are parallel. This T kind of stacking is there. So there is no pi-pi interaction for the free base ligand in the crystal. So the only thing that happens in the crystal is that rigidification causes a decrease in non-radiative rate constant. However, pi-pi stacking does not open up new ones. However, in case of aluminum complex, it's a monomer and it is planarized. So when you make crystals out of them, they stack, and the separation between the two almost parallel rings is only 3.5 angstrom, which is within pi bonding distance. So it appears that the reason why the fluorescence of aluminum complex is killed in crystals is that these planarized complexes come within pi-pi stacking. So pi-pi stacking kills fluorescence, and that brings us back to the zinc complex, where this pi-pi stacking is inbuilt because we believe it is dimeric. This, we think, is not only a good way to understand what happens in the crystals, but also some kind of a support for our hypothesis that it is pi-pi stacking that is responsible for the lesser amount of fluorescence, lesser extent of fluorescence in the zinc complex. If that is the case, the next question we asked is, suppose we introduce small little functional groups here. Instead of OH, not instead, beside this OH group, if you put in something like methoxy group or ethoxy group, then what happens? Two things can happen. First of all, rotation of these ethoxy and methoxy groups can become the major non-radiative pathway. In that case, there would be no enhancement in fluorescence upon complexation in solution, because even in the complex, the methoxy and ethoxy groups are rotating, and that is exactly what we see. The second thing that we hoped to see was that introduction of these alkoxy groups, we hoped, would mess up this nice planar arrangement in the complexes, so that they would no longer be planar, and so the pi stacking would be hindered in the solid state, in the crystals. That is exactly what happens here. They're no longer planar, they become somewhat puckered, so pi stacking is disturbed, and that is reflected immediately in the decays. Now, if you see, the solid state has a nanosecond lifetime. So this sort of strengthens our belief that in this class of compounds, you have to avoid pi stacking if you want to prepare a strongly fluorescent species. But a disclaimer is important here. There have been reports in literature where pi stacked fluorescent organic solids have been prepared. So we cannot claim that this is a universal truth, but we can definitely say that this is correct for the class of molecules that we are presently studying. With that background, we started off in our quest for emissive zinc complex. You might remember that zinc complexes are not all that emissive, they have picosecond lifetime. And now that we think that pi stacking is the villain, we started looking for compounds which would form zinc complexes that may be monomeric, may be dimeric, we don't know, but would not have pi stacking. So our question was, do we get strong fluorescence there or not? And this is where Sauradeep comes in, and here we have Orko-Prabhu's picture. So Sauradeep and Orko-Prabhu are carrying on with this kind of work. So Sauradeep found this molecule in literatures, which we call the Salam P, and it was reported that Salem-P forms two kinds of zinc complexes depending on which anion is used. With acetate, it forms this bridged kind of complex where the Salem-P molecules in the complex are like this. It is still a dimeric complex, but you do not have pi stacking. And the other report that was there was with perchlorate, where the literature report was that it forms a monomeric complex. The problem is we did not get monomeric complex. We got a dimeric complex like this, but with one zinc center. Well, no, not dimeric complex. We get a zinc complex in which there are two Salem-P units that are well perpendicular to each other, but one zinc center. The report that was there earlier is that there is one zinc center and one Salem-P. The remaining parts are taken up by the ligand. We were not able to get that complex, and interestingly, in that paper that we referred to, the file that was uploaded with the structure, that is not accessible. So we don't know what happened there, but we have repeated this many times. We are convinced that this is the structure that we get with perchlorate. But the crux of the matter is that both the zinc complexes that we have prepared do not have pi stacking. And the aluminum complex is also reported to be like this zinc complex, where the Salem-P molecules are perpendicular to each other. Here, what we see is that if you look at the quantum yields, Salem-P has a quantum yield of 0.003. We'll come back to the anion later. Zinc Salem-P of the two kinds have quantum yield of about 0.3. Aluminum Salem-P has a quantum yield of something like 0.36, which is not all that different. You might remember that in case of cellophane, the difference was more than an order of magnitude. And here it is different by 10%, 20%, which is perhaps within the error limit. So first of all, we seem to stand vindicated, even with the steady state data, that one can prepare strongly fluorescent zinc complexes if one can avoid pi stacking in this class of molecules. If we go down to liquid nitrogen temperature, then there is a considerable blue shift, increase in lifetime. We are going to come to the lifetime soon. Another interesting observation we made is that we made anion out of this previous ligand. We added OH minus and deprotonated it. And we find that the anion itself is strongly fluorescent, right? 0.04. It's not really close to that of anion, but it is still one order of magnitude less than the zinc Salem-P or aluminum Salem-P complexes, but it is an order of magnitude more than previous Salem-P. So what we are saying is that not only what is the possible application of this kind of work? Possible application is in sensing zinc and aluminum, right? What we are saying is that there's another possible application. If you can go to maybe a basic medium where the anion would be formed, the anion itself is strongly fluorescent compared to the previous ion, and the lifetime, as we'll see, is different from the lifetime in these complexes. But before getting there, we looked at the ultrafast dynamics. We saw that if you perform experiments on the free base Salem-P, then we can actually see the excited state photon transfer happening. The cis keto state growing from the locally excited enol state very rapidly, over hundreds of femtosecond, and we get a lifetime of 7 picosecond for the cis keto state because of the flexible backbone. For the anion, however, the dynamics are much slower. First of all, in the anion, there is no phenolic OH proton. So there is no question of proton transfer. But what you get is you get an excited state that is somewhat similar to the nature state. It's just that you produce it by direct excitation. Now here we see that the locally excited state first gets solvated and perhaps also undergoes conformational relaxation to produce a more stable excited state, which now has a lifetime of 800 picoseconds. So now see the difference in lifetime between the neutral molecule and the anion is from 7 to 800 picosecond, 100 times increase. And when we make the complexes, the lifetime is nanosecond. So we see that the lifetime is 6 nanosecond for both the complexes. For both the zinc complexes rather. An aluminum complex has a lifetime of 9 nanoseconds. So first of all, the anion has discernible fluorescence, but its lifetime is significantly different from the aluminum complexes. So you can sense different things. Suppose you start with the anion, you can look at its free form and complex form just by looking at lifetimes. Secondly, lifetime of zinc complexes now is 6 nanosecond and 6 nanosecond. 6 nanosecond. So again, we go back to the same point. Absence of pi stacking helps. However, the lifetime of aluminum complex is still a little more. One might think that 6 and 9 are not very different, but if you look at the decays, they are different. Yeah, one is 1.5 times the other. So why is it that the aluminum complex is still more emissive? That is because, most likely, because the aluminum complex, as I said a little while ago, it has been shown in this Chemistry European Journal paper that it forms more rigid complexes. So little bit of flexibility will also be associated with non-radiative deactivation that is suppressed in a more efficient manner in the aluminum complex compared to the zinc complexes. So we are now being able to sort of develop a bigger picture of this entire class of molecules. Now the anions that are anions being more strongly fluorescent than the free base ion, is it only for Salempy or is it a universal phenomenon? Looks like it's a universal phenomenon. We went back to Salopen and we studied its anion, and we see that once again there the lifetime is 900 picosecond, more or less the same as that for Salempy. And we are also very happy about this paper that came out in Journal of Indian Chemical Society, because it got published in Professor Sathan Basu's manuscript. Professor Sathan Basu was one of the father figures of chemistry in general and physical chemistry in particular in India. He introduced the first course in the country on quantum chemistry in Calcutta University, and he is also my academic great grandfather. He was the PhD guide of Professor Manish Chaudhary, who was the PhD guide of Professor Kankan Bhattacharya. So we're happy to be able to contribute to this special issue to the founding father of the lineage. And this work, this Orkoprovo's work, we work with another kind of shift base, which is called HBAP. Once again, we get the almost 1 nanosecond kind of lifetime. So the stronger fluorescence with longer lifetimes is a universal phenomenon. However, if you take the same anion and cool it down to liquid nitrogen temperature, 77 Kelvin, you get a significantly stronger lifetime again. Why? Because all the flexibility that is there, that is now gone, cannot move anymore. Interestingly, they have all single exponential fluorescence decays, thankfully, unlike Salofen, because Salofen is a little more complex molecule. So it is difficult to work with Salofen, but since these are single exponential, we are more confident in working out the radiative and non-radiative rates, etc. As I said earlier, these may be possible sensors for basic media. That is the kind of work that we are trying to do inside cells or inside things like, models of cells, protocells. So let that be the story for another day. This is another story for another day. Why are the anions more fluorescent? The answer is perhaps known, because actually other anions are more fluorescent than free bases also. And the most celebrated example being fluorescein. It's just that we don't know. So we'd like to learn why is it that the anions are more fluorescent. But to conclude this part of the story, what we have been able to do is that we have been able to build a roadmap all the way from a very feeble fluorescent molecule with lifetime of 7 picosecond through the anion, which is actually the form in which it ligates, to the complex. And with this knowledge, we hope to devise potential applications in analyte sensing as well as hopefully bioimaging. In the next about 15-20 minutes that we have, let me talk about another class of fluorogenic molecules that we are interested in, mainly because they have promise in organic electronics. So this molecule, which we call DBMPT, now again we got lured into this problem by my colleague Professor Anil Kumar. So started by an erstwhile postdoc Anushwa, carried on by Shomodipto, second postdoc, and Sharmishta. You have seen Sharmishta's photograph quite a few times today, and Shomodipto's too. As you see, this molecule has a very flexible structure. So it is not fluorescent in a solution. However, if you add a bad solvent like water, in acetone it dissolves freely and is hardly fluorescent. If you add water to form aggregates, it becomes strongly fluorescent. So it exhibits what is now fashionably called aggregation-induced enhancement of emission. Now, there are some people who don't like this term. Again, to that, what I'll say is that, see, the thing is, mostly this term has been popularized because of Professor Benzong Tang, who has performed seminal work, sort of opened this field. And this is now a widely accepted term, so let us just go by it. Whoever has objection to this term, we are going to use whatever term you propose once you become more famous than Benzong Tang. Right. So this is what it is: aggregation-induced enhancement of fluorescence. And we saw that we can produce this strongly fluorescent nanorods from these solvent mixtures of acetone and water. However, this is not a very satisfactory experiment because production of these nanorods is not always reproducible. There's no guarantee that if I produce nanorods from 7:3, every time I'll get nanorods that look exactly the same. So what we did is we thought, can we clean up the situation by adding some soap? We added surfactant. The idea was the surfactant itself has templating properties. So these mixed aggregates of high concentration of DBMPT and surfactant, do they behave better? And the answer is yes. Now you see, we get nanorods that are more regular, and we see these nanorods not only under the electron microscope, but also in confocal microscopy. And whenever we get nanostructures, we have this doubt that are these structures that are there in the solution also, or in the solvent mixture, or are we forming these structures because we have removed the solvent? So we perform cryo-TEM, and there also we see these nanorods. And of course, there is strong enhancement of fluorescence. Now we proposed a proof of the concept experiment. In these aggregates, we added perylene, and we could show that we get near perfect white light from this milieu. So this seems to have some potential application in organic electronics. Now, how do these nanoaggregates evolve? How does the morphological evolution take place? That is something that we followed by fluorescence lifetime imaging microscopy. This is a facility that we have established a couple of years ago, and this is a central facility of the institute. Anybody in India can send samples or come over, pay a nominal charge, and do experiments on this instrument. So what we can essentially do in this instrument is that we can look at fluorescence lifetime under a microscope. And we can also use fluorescence lifetimes to produce pseudo-colors to get images that are not only pleasing to the eye, but also are clearer, because you can sort of give contrasting colors to different parts and see different parts of a heterogeneous system more clearly. So what we see here is that in absence of surfactants, we get this kind of random aggregates. And the lifetime associated with these aggregates is about 1 nanosecond or so. The moment we add a little bit of surfactant, we see these nanorods form. But even in this picture, you can see that not only do you have nanorods, you have the smaller irregular aggregates also. And when we look at the lifetime distribution, we see we still have the strong distribution around 1 nanosecond. That is the lifetime of homoaggregates. But you see something coming up in longer lifetime. So that is for the mixed aggregate with surfactant. And as we add surfactant, the homoaggregates make way for the mixed aggregates. Not only that, the mixed aggregates themselves evolve. And that is what you see in this distribution of lifetimes for these aggregates. As you add more and more surfactants, not only you get more number of aggregates, you get a more homogeneous distribution of lifetimes, which tells us that the environment of these fluorophores in the aggregates also become more regular. So you get homogenization at higher surfactant concentration. And this is depicted in a little artistic manner by Soumyaditya in this cover figure that we had last year. That work being done, we wanted to see whether we can achieve something similar using a different system, triblock copolymers. Soumyaditya had some expertise in triblock copolymers from his PhD days. So we decided to work with two kinds of triblock copolymers. Well, triblock copolymers are, well, as the name suggests, they are polymers which have three blocks, three different polymers joined together. That's why copolymers. And typically, the kind of copolymers we work with are such that the core is non-polar, so this kind of a core, and on the periphery we have polar groups. The difference between the two polymers we used, P123 and F127, is in this hydrophilic extremity. The hydrophobic core is the same in both the cases. In both the cases, we get a significant enhancement in emission. Interestingly, the morphologies are different depending on what kind of triblock copolymer one uses. If we use P123, the shorter one, we get microspheres. If we use F127, the longer hydrophilic chain, we get nanorods. And once again, we get microspheres and nanorods not only after removing the solvent under a microscope and all, we also see it in cryo-TEM. So it is there in the solution also. Why do we get two kinds of morphologies? Is it just because of the triblock copolymers themselves? Well, actually, no. This is data from Soumyaditya's PhD work, where he had shown that both P123 and F127 form spherical micelles that are much smaller in size. See, the scale bar is 5 nanometer, where this scale bar is 1 micron. Much smaller spherical micelles if you have only the triblock copolymers. But in presence of DBMPT, you get two kinds of morphologies, microsphere or nanotubes. So whatever is happening not just because of the triblock copolymer difference in them, but also because of the differential interaction with DBMPT. We don't know yet the reason for difference in shapes. We are trying to talk with MD simulation people, but so far we have not had success because this is a rather intimidating system to model. Now, how will we do it? Coarse grain model is not going to work because you have to do an atomistic treatment of DBMPT at least, and atomistic treatment of a system of this size is not easy. To cut a long story short, let me just show you the data that in this case also we can follow the morphological evolution of these nanoaggregates using FLIM. And I thought this cartoon is prettier than the actual data to convey the message that these microspheres that we get are not successful in penetrating cell membrane. However, these nanorods of F127, perhaps because they're needle shaped, they successfully penetrate the cell membrane, enter the cell, and selectively localize in lipid droplets, the light of the lipid droplets. So here we have a fluorogenic molecule based system which has some potential in intracellular imaging as well. Because not only do certain kinds of aggregates enter the cell, they seem to have a preference for a particular kind of cellular intracellular organelle over the others. So intracellular imaging is one field that we are now trying to explore with these aggregates. So that brings us to the end of the story. To summarize, in all this discussion that we had, the main theme really is to understand excited state dynamics, understand how one can modulate the excited state dynamics, and then try to devise applications out of them. And in devising applications, that is where we are trying to get now through collaboration with certain colleagues. Let me thank all students present and past, all postdocs present and past, collaborators at different times, funding agencies, and of course our department and institute for everything. I hope to see many of you in sometime in future in this beautiful campus of ours, which is not only good in infrastructure and the research that goes on, but we also boast a surprising collection of flora and fauna. All the photographs that you see here are actually taken on campus, some of them out of my office window. It is a privilege working in a beautiful place like this. It's also a privilege getting an opportunity, thanks to Ananta, to share some of our findings with you today. Thank you very much. I'll be happy to answer questions if any.
Thank you, sir. First of all, I would like to thank for accepting our invitation with your busy schedule, sir. So thank you, sir. Thank you, sir, for your nice explanation on quantum dots, nanodots, and their application in several purposes. And also, you have nicely discussed the photogenic property of the several complex molecules. So, dear participant, if you have any query, please you can ask. Hello. Any questions from participants, please?
There is some question in the chat box, it seems.
In the chat.
Oh, Biman, but Biman,
you already answered.
Yeah, this is answered.
Sir, I think you have shown a one compound that is hydroxyamine compound, and you told that you got the crystal with zinc by single molecule. Say no, the dimer.
Yeah.
And it is reported that they got, I think.
Yeah, this one.
No, sir. One compound you have used. They used the aluminum complex.
Yeah. This one, right?
Yeah. Yes, sir.
So I just take you to the structure. Here are the structures. So this one.
Yes. So that is. So I want, sir, go to the previous slide, sir. Yeah, this one, sir.
All right.
So that in dimer complex, they have reported. Sorry, you have reported that zinc is coordinated with oxygen, imine nitrogen, and pyridine nitrogen.
Yes.
And two molecules. That means 2:1.
Yes,
and
exactly.
They have reported 1:1.
They have reported 1:1, and the other positions are taken up by the anion and solvent and all.
Sir, I didn't get that there. I didn't understand also that thing. That you told that you asked some data or something.
See, the thing is, it's published work, right? So if you go to the supporting information, you're supposed to get this file where the detail of the structure is given.
Okay.
CIF file. That file is not available.
Okay.
So what we thought is that we look at the CIF file and we compare it with ours and all. That file is not even there. So we have no way to actually look at what they have. But well, whatever it is, we are not getting that complex. Our purpose is served, but we are a little surprised that when identical conditions we get different things.
But sir, your condition and their condition also not same.
Why?
Because you have used the zinc chloride, and they have used the zinc acetate.
No. Zinc acetate is okay. Zinc acetate and zinc chloride, these are both reported in literature. So with zinc acetate, this structure is reported. and that is what we got. Problem is
Okay,
with
okay.
zinc chlorate, the structure that is reported is 1:1, and the structure we
Okay,
get is
okay.
1:2. We tried to replicate their condition completely, and it's a very simple. I mean, you know very well, right? How difficult is it to make these
Yeah,
complexes?
sure.
How many different ways can you make it? So you just basically
Now-
mix and stuff. So it is a little surprising that we are not getting 1:1, but well, no harm done.
Now I understand. Actually, I thought maybe they have done the in zinc acetate, you have done zinc chlorate.
No. We have done both, and with
Both
acetate
ways.
we get whatever result is there. With chlorate we don't.
Sir, can we use the some organic molecules to synthesis that organic quantum dot?
Yes.
But and what should be the basic things will be required for molecule?
So it should be such that the exciton should delocalize over the entire particle. So with organic molecules, what happens is that each molecule is like an island, right? So if you excite the molecule, you can have an electron in the excited state and all. But the idea is that when these organic molecules come together, they should form a solid that has that kind of a band structure. And then if the size is small, you should have energy levels, discrete energy levels within the band. So generally, you can achieve it using things like conjugated polymers and all. So the entire idea is that you should not have your excitation localized on one molecule. It should be delocalized over the entire particle. If that happens, then your job is done. Did we lose him or did we lose me? All right.
Sir, I was disconnected, sir.
Okay, no issue.
Okay.
So I was wondering who got disconnected, you or I.
So dear participant, if you have any query, please ask. I think, sir, they have no questions, sir. So thank you again, sir, for your valuable time and your presentation, sir. Thanks.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure being here. And if there's any further query, if there's any way we can help anybody, please feel free to drop an email and we'll see what we can do. Okay, Ananta, all the best to you as well.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Bye.
See you, sir. So, dear participants, some participant has joined. I have some query actually. Some participant has joined in the, just 1 minute.